On the morning of September 15, 1940, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding stood inside the underground operations room at Bentley Priory, listening to the measured voices of plotters and controllers as radar tracks crept across the map table. Dowding was not a man given to theatrical gestures. He had spent the summer watching numbers erode, pilots killed or wounded faster than they could be trained. Squadrons rotated until exhaustion became routine. Yet that morning, as waves of German aircraft crossed the English coast in broad daylight, he understood something fundamental had shifted. The Luftwaffe was no longer striking the fragile arteries of Fighter Command. It was flying straight toward London. The change was not accidental, and it would not be reversed. It was the consequence of Adolf Hitler's decision-making, shaped by ego, misjudgment, and a fatal misunderstanding of how Britain was fighting the war. Hitler's interest in Britain had always been conflicted. He admired the British Empire, despised what he saw as its racial dilution, and believed, against mounting evidence, that Britain would eventually seek terms once France collapsed. After June 1940, with Paris occupied and the Wehrmacht triumphant, Hitler assumed strategic inevitability was on his side. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was issued as Directive No. 16 on July 16, 1940, but even then it was conditional. The invasion depended entirely on achieving air superiority over southern England. That task was assigned to Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, whose confidence matched Hitler's own. Göring promised results quickly. His record in Poland and France suggested he might deliver. Neither man fully understood the system they were about to challenge. The Battle of Britain did not begin as a single dramatic clash, but as an extended contest between organizations. Fighter Command was not merely squadrons and aircraft. It was a centralized, integrated system combining radar stations, observer corps reports, filtered intelligence, and disciplined command control. Dowding had built it deliberately in the 1930s, often against resistance from peers who favored offensive bombing. By July 1940, Fighter Command could track incoming raids with sufficient warning to scramble only the squadrons needed, preserving strength while forcing the enemy to fight under controlled conditions. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was built for rapid campaigns over land, not sustained attrition over hostile seas. Its bombers lacked range for escort. Its pilots were not trained for prolonged engagements, and its intelligence underestimated both British numbers and resilience. Initial German operations reflected this misunderstanding. In July and early August 1940, Luftwaffe attacks focused on shipping in the Channel and coastal targets, probing British responses. Losses were tolerable, but results were inconclusive. On August 13th, designated Adler Tag, Göring launched what he believed would be the decisive assault on Fighter Command. Poor weather disrupted coordination. Intelligence failures misidentified targets, and German bombers struck airfields that were either peripheral or quickly repaired. The RAF lost aircraft and pilots, but its command structure remained intact. Crucially, Dowding resisted pressure to meet every raid in the air. He absorbed damage, rotated squadrons, and refused to gamble his force on a single climactic battle. By late August, German attacks intensified against sector airfields in southern England. These were the nerve centers of Fighter Command, controlling multiple squadrons and coordinating radar information. Damage to Biggin Hill, Kenley, and other fields began to strain British defenses. Aircraft were serviceable, but maintenance crews were exhausted. Pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties a day. Dowding's reserves were thin. At this moment, the Luftwaffe was closer to achieving its objective than it ever would be again. British aircraft production exceeded German estimates, but trained pilots did not. Losses mattered asymmetrically. Had pressure on the sector system continued for several more weeks, Fighter Command's ability to operate cohesively might have collapsed. It was here that Hitler's ego intervened. On the night of August 24, 1940, a small group of German bombers, likely off course, dropped bombs on central London. The material damage was limited, but the political significance was immediate. Churchill ordered retaliatory raids on Berlin. The RAF's bombing was modest and militarily insignificant, but it struck something more sensitive than infrastructure. It punctured the image of invulnerability cultivated by the Nazi leadership. Hitler, who had promised the German public that no enemy bomber would ever reach the capital, took it personally. Göring, who had guaranteed Berlin's safety, was humiliated. Strategic priorities shifted not through careful assessment, but through wounded pride. On September 4th, Hitler addressed a crowd in Berlin, publicly vowing to annihilate British cities if bombing continued. 3 days later, on September 7th, the Luftwaffe launched a massive daylight raid against London's docklands. Nearly 350 bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, crossed the Channel. Fires burned across the East End. Civilian casualties mounted. For the first time, the British capital became the primary target. The Blitz had begun. From a psychological perspective, the attack was intended to break morale. From a military perspective, it was a fundamental error. The shift relieved pressure on fighter command's airfields precisely when they were most vulnerable. Dowding immediately recognized the opportunity. Squadrons withdrawn to the north were rotated back south. Airfields were repaired. Command and control stabilized. German bombers, now flying deeper inland, faced longer routes, reduced escort time, and greater exposure. The Luftwaffe believed it was delivering a decisive blow, but British fighter losses fell while German losses rose. On September 15th, the largest daylight assault of the campaign met concentrated RAF resistance. Approximately 1,500 aircraft engaged across southern England. German losses were significant enough that Göring suspended daylight bombing raids soon after. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The consequences of that decision extended far beyond the autumn of 1940. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy Fighter Command, not because it lacked the means, but because its leadership misunderstood the nature of the system it was attacking. Hitler's insistence on symbolic punishment over operational necessity revealed a deeper flaw in his command style. He equated political intimidation with strategic effect. He assumed that civilian suffering would translate directly into governmental collapse. Britain's response proved the opposite. Civilian morale, while strained, did not break. Industrial output continued. Fighter command survived. The war continued. Individual lives illustrate the cost of this misjudgment. RAF pilots, many barely in their 20s, flew aircraft like the Hurricane and Spitfire at the limits of endurance. Losses were severe. In August alone, Fighter Command lost over 450 pilots killed or wounded. German aircrew losses were similarly heavy, but Germany lacked a system for recovering downed pilots over enemy territory. British pilots bailed out and returned to fly again. German pilots became prisoners of war. Attrition favored the defender. Hitler either failed to understand this asymmetry or chose to ignore it. The Battle of Britain also exposed the limits of centralized authoritarian control in modern warfare. Hitler involved himself increasingly in operational decisions without possessing the technical understanding to make them sound. Göring, rather than correcting false assumptions, reinforced them to protect his status. Luftwaffe intelligence consistently overestimated British losses and underestimated replacements. When reports suggested Fighter Command was on the verge of collapse, they confirmed what Hitler wanted to believe. Evidence to the contrary was dismissed. This feedback loop between ego and authority proved fatal to German strategy. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had shifted almost entirely to night bombing. The immediate threat of invasion had passed. Britain remained in the war, undefeated and increasingly confident. The resources expended in the Battle of Britain could not be replaced easily. Germany had lost experienced aircrew, aircraft, and strategic momentum. When Hitler turned east toward the Soviet Union in 1941, the Luftwaffe entered the campaign already weakened. Its bomber force diminished. Its fighter arms stretched across multiple fronts. The failure to defeat Britain ensured Germany would fight a prolonged, multi-front war it was structurally ill-equipped to win. In the end, the Battle of Britain was not decided by a single dogfight or speech, but by a pattern of decisions rooted in personal belief rather than strategic reality. Hitler's ego demanded retaliation where patience was required. It demanded visible punishment rather than sustained pressure. Dowding, constrained by limited resources and political skepticism, trusted his system and absorbed losses without abandoning his strategy. One leader sought validation. The other sought survival. The outcome shaped the course of the Second World War. Britain remained a base for Allied operations. The United States would later enter a war that still had a foothold in Europe. And Hitler's first major strategic failure, born not of weakness but of pride, marked the moment when the illusion of inevitable German victory began to fracture.